No, I don't think there's a decline in the nations. There is a general consensus that we need to do something about immigration. I don't think that there is this overwhelming sweep of far right.
Hello everyone. Today I'm honored to have Pyotr Kurzin. He has completed his MA in International Relations and Affairs from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and has worked with Amnesty International, the International Crisis Group, and the World Bank. He hosts the podcast called The Global Gambit, where he hosts eminent personalities from the field of IR, economics, and defense. So, Pyotr, thank you for your time and welcome.
Thank you. It's a very big pleasure to be on.
So, I want to start by talking about the recently held European parliamentary elections. The establishment parties have held ground, but the populist parties have gained ground in the major countries such as France, Germany, and Italy. So, do you think their gains are going to influence the policy of any major issues?
Yeah, so as always with these kinds of things, keep in mind that whilst we refer to Europe as a collective entity, it is a continent that's got, 40 plus nations, 27 in the European Union, and each of them is an independent actor and has its own motivations. So whilst there are some common themes like, frustrations over immigration, concerns about Ukraine, climate change, there are individual issues that affect the performance and results of each member state. In this case, I think that the overall policies of Europe are being influenced by populism. But if you look at the results of the European Union Parliament itself, there wasn't much change in the overall composition of the Parliament. So there's about 720 seats for members of the European Parliament or MEPs. And there was a notable loss for the centre party coalition. So each set of parties in each country band together under coalition groups or blocks, which then form the European Parliament. The largest is the European People's Party, which is or EPP, which is the sort of centre right. But there was a centre bloc, which was predominantly made up of Emmanuel Macron, France's president, Renaissance Party, which saw a notable loss. And also the Green Bloc, which is unsurprisingly made up of the Green parties, which also saw a bit of a loss. So the centre-left centre saw some losses at the hands of the right, so the National Rally. And that's because which we'll probably come to in a bit, the National Rally of Marine Le Pen in France did exceptionally well in the national elections, getting 30% versus Macron's 15%, and why we've now got this upcoming French election. So the composition did change a little bit, but not enough in the main blocks that the parliament is suddenly going to have a completely different set of people running the European Union. Von der Leyen is still expected to be the leader of the relevant institutions, but generally speaking, there is I would say, whilst the overall composition is relatively the same, they are going to be taking more consideration of more right-wing aligned policies. So, for example, immigration, von der Leyen has been toughening up her rhetoric. She's been making stronger statements around migration because of the popularity of Giorgia Meloni, the current leader of Italy. And that, coupled with Marine Le Pen, who will probably do quite well, shows you that there is a growing sort of there's certainly an adoption of certain rhetoric that we might not have seen a few years ago. So I don't think there's going to be a massive shift in policy in overall areas, but in certain specific issues, you probably will. But it's difficult to say, obviously.
So the traditional media always sounds the alarm bell when these parties, the far right parties, gain ground in the elections. So, what are the main issues do you think that have influenced the people to vote for these parties in such huge numbers? Do you think it's immigration or the industrial decline of these nations?
No, I don't think there's a decline in the nations. I think that that's very overhyped. Every country has issues. France and Germany were the two main countries with the biggest results of more right leaning. I hate to use far right because that's quite a broad and vague term. And Georgia Meloni is right leaning, but she's also softened a lot of her rhetoric. Marine Le Pen is not as far right as Eric Zemmour, who's on the far end of the spectrum in France. So it depends really who you ask. But the two biggest economies and two biggest, bedrocks of the EU, the French and Germans, have seen a significant shift to the right, the AfD in Germany. But that was also geographically, historically, because of the split between East and West Germany. If you look at any of the maps of Germany after the election, the AfD did incredibly well in the eastern part of Germany. But as I said, the overall continent hasn't seen this mass adoption of far right, populist right, as we thought. The Nordic states saw a notable shift leftwards, mainly because there have been quite a few far right parties that have been in government or have been in a coalition of a government in the past few years. Take Finland, for example. The Finnish far right party, the Finns party, I think it's literally called the Finns party. They've been managing the financial part of the government as part of the coalition, and the Finnish population have not been impressed with their performance. The incumbent far right coalition government in Sweden has not been keeping to their promises. And this is the thing: when people who voted for far right or fringe parties begin to realize that the radical promises that these parties make, but then don't follow through on because they're constrained by the overall system, they realize that the centre parties, whilst they're a bit more establishment, might actually be a little bit better. And you see this. It happens in politics all the time. People shift to the fringes and then they come back to the centre, right? It's a constant ebb and flow. And that's what we're seeing in England, right? The UK, after years of the Conservative Party, which has got increasingly more right-leaning to play to nationalistic and wave off Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party, or now Reform UK, the British public are voting largely expected to be for the Labour Party, which is very central, or even centre-left in certain issues. So I don't think that there is this overwhelming sweep of far right, as some people like to claim. It's just a natural part of politics. And when it comes to issues, I mean, there is a general consensus that we need to do something about immigration. The Nordic states have had less of an issue with immigration in the past couple of years relative to Italy now. And Giorgia Meloni, who has been obviously a huge advocate for tougher response to immigration on the southern coastline, because Italy's the first, that's the most southern nation, so that's where most people arrive on the islands and then walk or travel upwards to Germany, Netherlands, France, and countries with better welfare programs. She has pushed for a what would you call it, like a naval, sort of a maritime border patrol that manages the southern coastlines and the Mediterranean, and basically tries to intercept these boats that are emerging. And the European Union a few years ago probably would have thought that that was way too strong, but they've started doing it. I forget the name of it, but the European Maritime Defence Agency is utilizing such a policy now anyway. So I think you're going to see an adoption and introduction of more right-leaning policies, but sort of not at the extent that some of the far right parties will claim, if that makes sense. Like they're claiming that they'll stop all migration or they'll send everybody back. And it's probably not that. It's more they will be more restrictive on their integration and migration laws. Denmark's a great example of this. They've the left-leaning party, which has been in power there, centre-left, have actually adopted a pretty, not anti-migration, but much more restrictive set of policies, which you would expect more from like the right and conservatives and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think you're going to see more restrictive policies, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's all because of the right, far right sort of taking power. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to come to the French elections. The Communists, Socialists, and the Greens have formed a coalition called as the New Popular Front. So, do you think they'll be able to stop Marine Le Pen's national rally from gaining power?
The New Popular Front is quite interesting. I'm not an intricate expert of French politics just because, well, we've got so much shit happening else in the UK at the moment. But when we had the general election 2 years ago, the French left was all over the place. Mélenchon, who is the de facto leader of this French coalition, because he's the most popular or associated with it, is absolutely very left, and he advocated at the time of the presidential election that voters go and vote for Macron because he was the lesser of the two evils. But that was for the presidential election, so it was based on him as an individual. And an individual can carry a party very well, even if the party itself is quite, well, crap. So in this regard, though, because these are parliamentary elections, it's difficult to see whether or not the French left is going to be obviously keen to get a good standing in the parliament. But what this means is that that could come at the expense of Renaissance and some of the centre left voters who are fed up with Macron's, uh, you know, policies and considerations. And you could see a pincer movement, essentially a squeeze on the left and the right between the National Rally and the New Popular Front. What is interesting, though, is I mentioned this Zemmour guy and his party. I forget
Eric
the name of
Simon.
it, but he's really, yes, he's really right. And his deputy, if I understand correctly, she was trying to find favor with the National Rally, and some of her sort of colleagues were, and Zemmour basically ousted them. He evicted them from the party. So that internal dispute, if you like, between two of the right factions, parties of the French political spectrum may well be welcomed by Emmanuel Macron and the centre bloc. But what it could also mean is that because there is now a clear distinction that you've got the Republican Party, the traditional party of Nicolas Sarkozy, is essentially being squeezed and could eventually be actually eradicated. And so you've got the National Rally, which is sort of being just the center, the right party, right? It's just the big right party, and that's where anyone who's got more right-leaning ideologies will go and vote for that. Zemmour's party on the fringe, they're not going to do much. You've got the bloc, and then you've got the New Popular Front. So you could see a potentially very just evenly split across these three sorts of blocks. Obviously, the one that loses out most in its current situation is Renaissance and Emmanuel Macron. And the two most likely scenarios, I personally think it's going to be a hung parliament. So no one party dominates. And I think Macron is going to have to do some business with either National Rally or the New Popular Front. Keep in mind, the New Popular Front does have some centre-left parties that he could potentially seek some engagement with. But the overall dominance of that strong left, traditional left, is I think going to be opposing some of his policies. So I think the French parliamentary political scene is going to be going into a pretty, well, ineffective, dysfunctional period because not much is going to get done. So we'll have to see.
So, could you see this potential deadlock affecting Emmanuel Macron's legislative process? And do you think he might resign in case the deadlock affects his legislative
No,
agenda very badly?
no, Macron's not resigning. He is, I think, the most unpopular leader at the moment, partially because that's just how the French are. They always are incredibly, they're very critical of their leaders constantly, whoever's in power, but he's not going anywhere. And there is one theory, which is that Macron is gambling by allowing or inviting a right-wing bloc. Let's just play one scenario that, National Rally, the Le Pen party performs well and they get into power in the parliament, right? So he now has to work with a prime minister who is, well, very opposed to some of his policies, or that he has been trying to avoid getting into power. The deputy to Le Pen, he is young, he is handsome, he is energized, he's very good with social media. He's doing well. And this is the problem, which is that in French politics, or the semi-presidential system that they have, it's very much the prime minister that does the domestic policymaking. Macron is the head of state and is the front man in the face, but there's very little he can actually do in terms of influencing domestic French politics. So he's going to have to make concessions and he's going to have to compromise. And the theory is that he's gambling if there are enough French people who see the ineptitude and poor policy decisions and just governing that the National Rally have, they will ultimately get rid of them in the next election. So, they will vote in a centrist group because they realize that the right wing, this far right, whatever, this populist right party is not good. So it's a gamble. To be honest with you, I feel that that's such a stretch, and also such a legacy risking decision on Macron's part. And yeah, I'm not entirely sure. It's really tough to tell, to be honest with you, why he's made this decision. There's a lot of debate about what is his goal. One of them is this, try to give the French public a sense of why, you might think I'm bad or you're fed up with me, but that's the alternative, just how bad that is. And he's making the, he's putting it to the French people like, are you sure you want to go through this sort of thing? And then when the French people wake up and realize, oh crap, we could actually have a government that is made up of these kinds of people, or something like that, that's his framing, then it won't work out like that. But I don't think it's going to. I think you're going to see the Renaissance squeezed and the New Popular Front and the National Rally perform relatively well.
So I just read an interesting story that day in the Guardian that a young lady was asked whom you're going to vote for, and she mentioned that she's going to vote for Marine Le Pen's party just because her deputy is very hot.
Yeah, well, there is that as well. The guy. Well, I think he's well, it'd be weird for me to say, he's dishy or something, but yeah, there will be some people like that. There's this protege, Gabriel Attal, I think it is, who is seen as Macron's protege, and he's quite young and good looking as well. So maybe you could have two hot guys vying for the leader. I'm kidding. I don't know, but there's definitely people like that. They want they want young, they want pin-up boy. Politics is funny like that.